The tavern was already breathing before dawn. Smoke clung to the rafters like ghosts unwilling to leave, and the air carried the mixed perfume of roasted barley, spilled ale, and wet stone. Marin Hale wiped down the counter with the same rag she'd used for 3 years, its edges frayed, its center soft as skin. The lantern and loot was her world, one of low ceilings, cracked windows, and quiet survival. Beyond the fogged glass, the city of Blackmorrow stretched in crooked streets, its lamps glowing like dying embers under the night's heavy breath. "Stay by the hearth, Tobin," she murmured without turning. Her son's small voice answered, "I am, Mama." He sat cross-legged on the floor, his fingers working at a wooden toy soldier missing one arm. The boy's hair was a copper halo in the firelight, bright against the tavern's dim. Marin glanced over her shoulder to make sure he was truly there, her gaze softening as it always did. He was her only clean thing in this soot-stained life. The morning crowd hadn't yet begun its grumble. Just a few regulars hunched over their mugs, dock workers, a merchant, 2 women who laughed too loudly at nothing at all. Marin moved through them with a quiet precision, like a ghost trained in service. Her fingers brushed a man's arm as she refilled his cup, and when he hissed, "Burnt myself on the stove, damn it," she instinctively touched the red welt on his hand. The skin cooled, the pain fled. The man blinked, then frowned as if unsure whether it had hurt in the first place. Marin pulled her hand back fast. "You imagined it," she whispered, more to herself than to him, and hurried away before he could speak. She kept her secret hidden the way she kept her tears, quiet, unseen, smothered. She'd learned long ago that strange gifts drew worse things than wonder. When the church bells tolled 6, fog rolled thicker through the streets. The tavern's door creaked open, bringing a gust of cold and the sound of horses. Marin froze, not because of the weather, but because of the metallic rhythm beneath it. Boots. The guards entered first. Their armor gleamed black under torchlight, engraved with the crimson insignia of the Valois line, the winged crown of the vampire kings. Behind them, a scribe unrolled a scroll. "By order of His Majesty," he announced, "a medical census shall be conducted. All citizens will submit a blood sample to the king's physicians for purity and health verification." The words hung like iron. Blood census, 2 words that made the room smaller. People shifted, murmuring. Marin pulled Tobin behind the counter, heart drumming. She'd heard rumors that the palace was hunting a sickness, some blood-borne corruption spreading among the higher houses. But commoners were always the ones to bleed first. When her turn came, she held out her hand. The guard's knife was small, ceremonial, just a prick. But when the blade bit her palm, the drop that welled up was wrong. It wasn't the dull red of everyone else's, it shimmered faintly, like a candle seen through water. She clamped her fist shut at once. Too late, the guard's eyes widened. "Did you see?" he started, but a murmur cut through the air outside. The slow roll of a black carriage. Through the tavern's doorway, the street parted like a curtain. The carriage windows were veiled, but Marin felt the gaze before she saw it, a cool, old awareness, centuries deep. A pale hand drew back the curtain. For the briefest second, she met his eyes. They were not the red of hunger, nor the silver of myth. They were gray, like morning ash, and they saw everything. The vampire king, Edran Valois, did not speak. He merely lifted one gloved hand, and the guards obeyed. Marin didn't remember the moment they took her. Only the smell of iron, the sound of Tobin shouting her name, and the echo of those ash-gray eyes following her into the carriage. The ride to the palace was silent but for the creak of wheels. Outside, Blackmorrow's skyline bled into fog, bridges like ribs, towers like tombstones. Inside, Marin sat rigid, her wrists trembling against her skirts. The guards didn't touch her. They didn't need to. The king's order was law enough. When the carriage finally stopped, the palace gates loomed before her, wrought iron shaped into the forms of wings and serpents. Beyond them, a courtyard of black marble, veined with crimson lines that glowed faintly as if blood itself ran through the stone. A woman met them in the corridor, tall, severe, draped in midnight silk. "Her Majesty is waiting," she said. They led Marin through hallways of candles and mirrors, every surface reflecting more shadow than light. The air was heavy, perfumed with something sweet and rotting. She tried not to breathe too deeply. Then she saw her. Queen Amelie lay on a bed of silver and bone, her body as thin as parchment, veins dark beneath translucent skin. Around her clustered priests and physicians, whispering prayers, mixing elixirs. The queen's chest rose shallowly, each breath a struggle against the inevitable. The king stood at her side, motionless. He looked younger up close, though time had carved patience into the corners of his mouth. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet and cold. "You touched her hand once, they say." Marin shook her head. I don't know what you mean. I didn't mean to do it again." She hesitated. The guards tensed. Then, trembling, she reached out. Her fingers brushed the queen's. A pulse of warmth leapt between them, faint but undeniable. The queen's lips parted, drawing a fuller breath. A sigh rippled through the room. For a heartbeat, color returned to the dying woman's cheeks. Marin snatched her hand back, staring. The king's eyes flicked to his mother, then to her, his composure fracturing just slightly, wonder, suspicion, and something dangerously close to hope. "Clear the room," he ordered. The physicians protested, but one look silenced them. When they were gone, he turned fully to Marin. "What are you?" "Just a waitress," she whispered. "No." He stepped closer, voice low, taut. "You are something older. Something I have waited for." "I don't know what happened," she said, clutching her apron as if it could shield her. "Please, my son." "You will see him again," Edran said. "When my mother lives." Marin stared at him, horror dawning. "You're keeping me here?" His gaze softened, but only barely. "You will be honored, protected. And if you truly have the gift your blood claims, then you may yet save a queen and a kingdom." Outside the tall windows, the moon broke through the fog like a blade. In the corridors, whispers began already. The Blood Witch has come. And in the heart of the palace, the king who had forgotten how to hope found himself listening to the rhythm of a mortal's trembling heart. As though it might one day change the pulse of the world itself, the palace was a thing of exquisite cruelty. Marble columns rose like pale ribs beneath a roof painted with scenes of dawn and slaughter. Tapestries hung heavy with dust, their threads catching the candlelight with a cold, distant sheen. Servants moved through the halls like drowned things, carrying silver bowls and whispered fears. Marin learned to walk that space with the same careful, measured steps she took behind her tavern counter. Eyes down, hands steady, voice small when required to speak. She slept in a narrow chamber above the servants' kitchens, a single window that watched the city's fog like a patient predator. Tobin's name was a stone in her throat every night. She had left him under the care of a woman who owed her favors and a ledger of debt, and every hour away felt like another risk stacked against the small life she loved. The court treated her as both marvel and affront. One moment, a duchess slipped a ribbon into her hair and called her miracle with lacquered lips. The next, a footman spat a curse and reminded her that she was a commoner and commoners bled for the comfort of the great. Marin moved between those attitudes like a reed in a storm. Her hands were used for polishing goblets and for touching the queen's wrist in the quiet hours when the physicians had given up. The same palms that smoothed tablecloths also coaxed the last shallow breaths from lungs that had forgotten how to live. It was a humiliating grace to be both servant and savior. She felt it in the way Edran's eyes watched her across the hall. Sometimes with hunger, sometimes with calculation, always with that ash-gray patience that made her skin feel too thin. Dr. Corvin Lark watched her like a man watching a wound. He was the chief physician, a small man with fingers stained perpetually with tinctures, a face mapped by too many late nights and too much certainty. At court he was a necessary cruelty, brilliant in his craft, quick to explain absence with equations and remedies. But he had the same dangerous habit as many assured men. He believed everything could be dissected, everything could be understood and therefore owned. Marin's gift resisted his instruments. When he asked for samples, she refused. When he attempted clandestine tests, a scratch at night, a vial stolen from the apothecary, the results were always wrong or burned to black at first touch. Lark's envy hardened into a small, private fury. He began to spy, to take notes in the margins of his medical codices, and to ask questions of the palace archivist. Sira Vaughn became an unlikely ally. She was slender as a book spine, and moved among the scrolls and ledgers of the palace archives with a scholar's tenderness. Her eyes were sharp as a knife's edge. They missed nothing. She took Marin into a back room that smelled of dust and old glue and unrolled a map of faded parchment across a table. "There are lines between what you know and what you fear," Sira said, fingers tracing letters no one else had read in years. She spoke of the House of Iron in low tones, of mortals who had once walked the shadowed edge between human and vampire, healers who had tended blooded wounds and bargained with the old hunger in ways that did not end in death. "The court burned them," she told Marin, "feared them. Men like Lark pretend to be hunters of the unknown, but really they are simply frightened of answers." Sira warned her with a phrase that tasted like prophecy. "The healer born of mortal pain shall wake the blood of dawn." Marin listened, heart clanging against her ribs. Prophecies in Blackmorrow were both currency and curse. The rich wrote them down in silk and never lived to see them fulfilled, and the poor had them whispered like curses in alleys. Marin wanted to laugh at Sira's certainty, to say no one knew anything except the next coin and the next meal. But there was a tremor in Sira's voice that was not learned fear. It was recognition. Marin felt the same tremor answer in the bones of her hand, where the memory of the man in the tavern had cooled under her touch. There were small rituals to being in the palace. Meals were served on plates that frowned at the light. Servants curtsied to portraits of ancestors who had once feasted on the spoils of conquest. Candles burned in chalices made from river stone and ivory. The queen's recovery, tentative, then startlingly swift, drew visitors and whispers. Citizens brought tribute in the form of tinctures and age-old prayers. Nobles brought theories and eyes like knives. The court began to test the limits of Marin's mercy in ways both petty and brutal. They demanded that she show the extent of her gift, that she recreate the miracle for a lord's gout or a child's fever, until she learned to refuse in thin, practiced voices. Each refusal flamed suspicion. Each success piled up obligations. Edran watched each of those moments with a patience that made her feel small and enormous at once. It was a curious intimacy, to be observed as if one were a problem set or a lesser god. When he spoke to her privately, he did so with the languid intensity of a man confessing without words. "You will not let them break you," he said one evening, when the moon was a coin lost in fog. The palace hummed with conversations he could not hear. They went on like a counselor's murmur, while he and Marin stood in the quiet where the queen's illness still breathed. He told her about the curse in fragments, like one assembling a fragile vase from cracked pieces. His mother had been mortal once, Amelie, a woman of stubborn light who had refused to leave Edran's side when death came knocking. She had bargained with things that do not bargain, traded years and warmth to hold her son's life like an ember. That bargaining had landed upon the Valois line like frost, a rot that ate from the inside, a corrosion of blood that no surgeon's scalpel could cut away. "We kept her alive," Edran said, "and in keeping her we kept the sickness." He looked at Marin as if looking for an edge of herself he might recognize. "Do you understand what it is to love someone so fiercely you would trade the world for them, and find the trade becomes a chain?" Marin understood love in small things. A breakfast made on time, a scraped knee kissed better, a lullaby hummed under wavering lamplight. She had not known the shape of monarchic sacrifice, only the small sacrifices of a mother trading sleep for safety. But she began to see a reflection of her stubbornness in Edran's grief, and that reflection made her chest ache in an unfamiliar way. She found herself listening to the cadence of his voice at night, telling herself it was simple curiosity, nothing more. When he told her that touching the queen had eased breath, he said it with a relief that battered him like the sea against a cliff. There was a hidden cost to each healing. The first time she left the queen's bed, her fingertips were numb and her head swam with a sweetness that tasted like iron and honey. Small bruises bloomed along her inner arm where she felt the sickness move within her, like a guest taking up room in a house without permission. It changed her sleep. She dreamed of folding knives and of hands reaching through fog. The healing worked by exchange. Marin's touch eased the illness's grip on the queen, but the illness did not vanish. It retreated into the only available vessel of living blood. At first Marin assumed it would be temporary, a tremor of fatigue she could sleep off. But the more she touched, the more her own strength thinned. A throb of pain began to nestle deep in her bones, and she would wake with the taste of copper on her tongue. Edran watched these transformations like a man watching a candle gutter. One afternoon, when a messenger brought news of a skirmish in the northern markets, Edran offered something Marin had not expected. A room in the palace where Tobin could stay, guarded and hidden from the city's predatory authorities. "I will keep him safe," he said. The words were velvet over steel. Marin's instinct was immediate and maternal. To say yes and run, to take her son and never look back. The offer was safety stitched with a threat. It came with the condition of her continued service, of compliance to the court's whims. "You would buy my child with my labor?" she asked, trying to keep the irony out of her voice. Edran's expression softened only for a breath. "I would keep him alive," he answered, "and you would keep him out of harm's way." He named the cost plainly, because kings do not barter in half-truths. She saw the map of the bargain, her freedom for her son's life, her future traded for the queen's continued breath. Marin was not a woman who could be bought easily, but she also could not pretend the image of Tobin sleeping under his protection did not root itself in the soft places of her heart. She refused, though, not from pride alone. There was a line she would not let anyone cross, not even a king who offered safety in a gilded cage. The palace's quiet patience began to crack. Sira's research turned up names and faded oaths, and when she told Marin about the House of Iron, the healers who had once stood as a bridge between mortal warmth and vampiric hunger, Marin felt a strange pull toward a history she had not known was hers. Sira showed her an ancient seal, 2 hands, one pale and one warm, entwined above a rising sun. The seal was the symbol of a blood pact, not of domination, but of mutual obligation. "They promised compassion in exchange for shelter," Sira said, and her voice tightened. "And the Valois gave them sanctuary until they feared the power in return. They burned the iron to ash and hidden the truth." The revelation came like a dagger. Marin was not merely a random miracle. The weave of her family's past braided with the royal line in a way that made the present inevitable. Sira found a ledger, marginalia written in a spidery hand, that told of a broken oath. An ancestor of Marin's had cut a pact with a Valois forefather during a famine, offering a healing hand to a dying prince in exchange for safety for their people. At some point the bargain had been betrayed, and the iron scattered, hunted like stray dogs. "You are the last seed," Sira murmured. Marin wanted to fling the ledger into the fire. To be the last seed meant being planted into a garden of expectation, a place where everyone might decide what you were for them. Rumors flourished where fear fed them. The council began to murmur against Marin's presence, their faces pinched with the old aristocratic disdain. Dr. Lark ramped up his intrusions. He attempted to take blood from her by subterfuge. In the dead of a night heavy with storm, he sent 2 cloaked attendants to her room to draw a sample while she slept. Marin awoke to their clumsy hands and a blade. She fought as any frightened mother would fight for the tenuous world she had built. The struggle was brief, for the guards responded quickly to the noise, but the wounds Dr. Lark inflicted with his instruments were not merely physical. His curiosity had the sharpness of a man who would rip out a heart to see how it beat. Edran found her in the corridor after the incident, pale and shuddering, a small smear of dried blood on her palm. The king moved like winter wind, and where he passed, people made room. He confronted Lark in the hall with a coldness that made even the physician's face blanch. "You will not touch her without my leave," Edran said. The command was law. Lark stammered apologies like wet cloth. But the doctor's resentment did not die. Pain had a habit of turning men toward cruelty when their reason failed. Politics turned sour as well. The council feared what it could not control and whispered of rebellion in the city. A fringe of radicals, men and women who had long resented Valois taxes and reprisals, began to conflate Marin's gift with unnatural ambition. Pamphlets appeared in the river markets that blackened her name and called her a witch-bearer. They spoke of half-blood children, of a race that would supplant humans at night. Fear made bold men cruel. The radicals believed that by attacking Marin, they could strike a blow against a monarchy that had swallowed their sons and their coin. The threat became reality when Tobin was taken. He disappeared one muddy morning while Marin helped dress the queen. The palace alarm was a serried thing. Gates locked, bells rung, and men with faces like cliff falls scouring the city. Marin's plea was raw, a sound she had never allowed herself to make before Edran. "Find him," she demanded, voice broken. "Find my son." Edran did not speak in the moment. He moved as if the space between them had tightened to a wire, then cut. He chose action over words. The king revealed a side of his power Marin had only glimpsed in stories told to frighten children. He stretched his arms and shadows rose like sails from his coat, becoming wings that tasted of dusk. In the narrow courtyard, Edran shifted into a more terrible form, not wholly monstrous in the lurid sense, but archetypal, a predator's silhouette against the moon. His fangs were long and silver-bright, not for feeding, but as talons of an old authority. Soldiers held their breath. Marin had never seen fear in Edran's face before that night. It was not fear for himself. It was an animal's hungry, desperate ferocity when something he cherished was threatened. They rode into the city limits under the ragged map of dawn, Edran at Marin's side, his presence drawing on the edges of her nerves. The radicals were a scattered, fervent group, but they had gone further than slogans. Tobin had been taken by men who believed his mother's blood could birth a new kind of being. In a warehouse that smelled of wet rope and old anger, Marin found her son bound but unbroken. He ran into her arms without hesitation, his face wet and small. She wept into his hair, feeling the ache of 1,000 nights compress into a single tremor. One of the radicals lunged at Edran with a blade, fury in his eyes that would have taken a lesser man. Edran moved with a speed that was less a blur than a shifting of air. The blade was a sliver against a wall. Blood sprayed, but not Edran's. One of the attackers lay with an open throat, eyes wide in a way that made Marin dizzy. In the scuffle, Marin saw a man fall and Edran sink a hand to his own chest, suddenly doubling over as if struck. The king's breath came ragged and deep. The curse seized him in a new way, spilling its poison closer to his heart. Marin did the only thing she could think to do. She reached for Tobin, then stepped toward Edran, who crumpled on the warehouse floor like a cut tree. Her hands shook as she placed them on the side of his face. She did not know whether pity or duty guided her touch, perhaps both. Warmth passed through her fingers into him, a current like river water, and a small, bright thread of pain knifed through her chest. Edran's skin, usually cool as marble, felt fever-hot in her hands, his blood heavy with rot. She tasted copper at the back of her throat and saw, as if through a pane of glass, the sickness sliding away from his chest into her own veins like smoke finding the chimney. Tobin's eyes widened. "Mama," he whispered, and Marin felt the world fold into that single sound. The wound in Edran's side eased. His breathing calmed. He opened his eyes and looked at her with a softness so acute it thinned her. He reached for her and with a voice that was almost a confession said, "You are more dangerous than I feared and more necessary." The prophecy's first seal, if such a thing had weight, had clicked into place not through ceremony but through desperate hands, a rescue, a mother's need, and a king's vulnerability. When they carried Tobin back to the palace, Marin's limbs ached as if she had given away more than warmth. The sickness that had slid into her blood did not vanish. It nested and made itself known in small ways. A tremor in the fingers when she held her son, a pallor that lingered at the edges of her face. But Tobin slept in his small bed that night safe, and Edran, newly steadied, sat by the queen's side with something like relief shadowing his features. The court was still a place of knives wrapped in velvet, but for a sliver of time, Marin found a strange, fragile rest. The bond between them was not yet declared in banners or law. It was a private, dangerous thing. Two bloodlines meeting in the dark, the healing of one bleeding into the survival of another. Queen Amelie's eyes opened like shutters pushed back after winter. For days the court had leaned over her bed as if their weight could summon life. For days Marin had sat at her wrist and offered warmth she no longer felt as entirely hers. When the queen's lids unsealed, the chamber inhaled as one body. The physicians bobbed and whispered, mouths shaped into questions they could not ask without sounding foolish. The priests crossed themselves and then crossed the air again to mark a miracle. The candles, which had guttered and sighed for so long, steadied as though some hand had smoothed the flame. Amelie's voice was a thin thing, made of parchment and old songs. She smiled at Marin with a clarity that scraped Marin raw. "You are tired, child," she said, and her voice bore no accusation, only a blunt, terrible affection. "And you have done what I asked not to be done." Her gaze did not flit to the physicians. She looked instead at Edran, who had not left her side. His jaw worked as if he wished to speak, and yet he remained still, the king made small by the enormity of something older than both of them. Marin's hand was still on the queen's wrist, though she had expected to be pushed back, to be given coin and couriered out like a thing no longer required. Instead, the queen took her fingers in that frail, papery hand and squeezed. The touch was absurdly warm. "I signed away years," Amelie continued, "for a son. I bartered warmth for breath. I thought I had paid every toll, but some debts are folded into the bone itself." A cough rattled her like a trayful of coins. She closed her eyes for a single blink as if summoning every memory at once. "I was meant to die," she said. The words fell between them like stones. The chamber stilled. Marin felt blood in her own ears, a sudden drum. "You knew," she whispered, and the accusation in that whisper was not toward the queen, but toward the design of the world that could ask such things of ordinary people. Amelie opened her eyes again and looked at Marin as though she had finally come to recognize the face of a long-lost debt. "Yes, I knew." The queen's fingers tightened. "Prophecies peel like onion skin, girl. They show you flashes, here a child, there a wound. I read them as a woman. I loved my son. That is all I have ever known. When they offered me the prolonging, when the elders at the shrine promised life for a life and a seed of protection for my bloodline, I accepted. I accepted because I could not bear to let him go." Her throat worked. "I thought my death would be the closing knot. I did not know your touch would unpick it and let the sickness find another throat." Edran's face was a map of raw, private things, horror and rage braided with a tender, ridiculous hope. "You lied," he said to his mother, but there was no accusation in it that sought to wound. It sought to understand how a life's architecture had been built on such a lie. "You let me live, and you let that thing root in my blood. Is that what you call love?" Amelie's smile was patient as a winter star. "I did what mothers do. I chose my child, Edran. I traded a future for the now. The prophecy told of a healer grown of mortal ache. I thought stupidly, cruelly, that such a thing would arrive and mend what we had become. I did not expect breath to be stolen back by miracles. I did not expect the bargain to be broken." Her hand twitched, and for the first time Marin saw the calculation in the wreckage of a woman who had worn love like armor. "Forgive me," Amelie said, "for the part I played, and forgive yourself, child. You have been the hand that did what surgeons could not, but fate is fussy. It will not let itself be rearranged without cost." A charge, low and electrical, ran under Edran's skin. He clutched at his chest, and the light in his gray eyes dimmed like a lantern being snuffed. Pain uncoiled through him as if the palace walls had turned their stones into teeth. The physicians rushed forward with instruments that looked suddenly paltry, and the priests began to murmur incantations like a worthless chorus. Amelie watched her son with the patience of someone who had watched multiple sunrises and was tired of hoping they lasted forever. "It must move," she said quietly. "Blood keeps its promises. If you give of yourself where a bargain was broken, the debt seeks a new ledger." The sickness, old as frost and as cunning, migrated as if deciding where it might root to do the most harm. It left the queen with a faint, jagged sigh as if an old thing had been nudged awake and then restrained. Edran's features twisted. His breath came fast and savage, as if the rot had bitten into muscle and sinew. Marin had felt the sickness take refuge in her limbs before. Now, as Edran buckled, she realized the curse could leap and settle wherever living blood could be siphoned. The queen, once dim and on the edge of death, lay calm with a face made serene, as if someone had finally closed a book she had never finished reading. She had been healed only because the illness had found another host, the host that loved her enough to be marked as kin. Guilt is an animal that gnaws on anyone close enough to its teeth. Marin's stomach turned. She had wanted to heal Amelie's breath and ease the world's moaning. Instead she had, with earnest hands, nudged a viper into her son's cage. Edran's eyes met hers for the briefest of seconds. Not accusing, not even pleading, simply hungry with the raw need of a man who had felt the certainty of his mother's recovery only to watch it be paid for at his expense. The bond between them, once tender and strange, was now laced with something bitter and urgent. Love felt suddenly like a blade you slept with. News spread like a stain across the city that night. The queen had awoken, but Edran suffered. The palace thrummed with a new tension. The council, once cautious and sullen, hardened into something cruelly pragmatic. Dr. Corvin Lark, his envy a coiled thing in his breast, found reason in suffering. Where medical curiosity once stained his gloves, now ambition slicked the palms of his hands. He began to speak of contingency plans in low voices to the council, ways to quarantine the illness, to isolate its vector, to harness what he called the healer's blood for study and for the betterment of the Valois line. He used the words study and contain the way a man might use rope and pulley, and the council nodded because fear tastes like policy when you are certain of your own righteousness. A portent came to them on the night the moon swallowed itself. The city braced as shadow crept over its face, and the world lost its usual curve. People in the markets looked up and felt their jaws tighten. Priests lit braziers along streets, folks whispered prayers older than the rooftops, and the palace bells tolled with a cadence that made even the guards shift uneasily. The lunar eclipse moved like a slow, hungry hand across the sky, and with it the court's old superstitions tightened like belts. Dr. Lark used the eclipse as cover. He had been studying the margins of Marin's blood in midnights and stolen minutes, collecting slivers and forcing them under lenses until even the glass burned. He had convinced several council members that the king's suffering presented an opportunity to control the curse, to build a new order where vampiric strength could be tempered by human healing. In other words, to place the Valois line above its own corruption by harnessing the healer's gift into a weapon or a commodity. Fearful men do commerce in human lives when the price is safety. So Lark's plan uncoiled in the dark, to seize Marin, to use her as both remedy and research, and to staple the curse to their advantage. He moved with the cunning of a man who had read many books and assumed knowledge was a right. He unleashed something he had cobbled together in laboratories and library basements, constructs of coagulated blood and memory called phantoms, half-spirit, half-flesh mannequins that fed on the life signs they could find and obeyed the hand that had wired them. He released them into the palace at the fall of night, and they slid through hallways like spilled ink. Their presence made the candles recoil. They smelled of old iron and of rain on graves. Lark had intended them to capture Marin, to bind her in a surgeon's net, while he extracted her blood and forced the bargain he fancied into law. Betrayal is a blade that does not announce itself. It comes as a handshake, a whispered plan behind closed doors, a sudden lock across the corridor. The council turned in that hour. Men who had dined with Edran now whispered his supposed weakness and promised to step in and save the realm from contagion. Lark's phantoms were the first move in a coup. Guards who had sworn oaths to the crown now hesitated. Some even turned their backs on the king when orders came down in the shape of council decrees. Palaces are built of complicity and compromise. The coup found its leverage in both. The phantoms were more than puppets. They carried with them a panic like a living thing. They seized servants and nobles alike, clinging and pressing until the warm blood ran and they drank. Marin found herself in a corridor of mirrors with a phantom in front of her, a figure like a fragmented man, its eyes like coins sluiced in river mud. Its fingers unknotted into claws and reached, and Marin recoiled not from terror alone, but from a cold, clinical recognition of what Lark had attempted. The constructs were violent perversions of the healer's task. Instead of mending, their touch hollowed and fed. She did not have time to think of countermeasures. The palace exploded into motion. Screams, the clang of armor, the thunder of footsteps. Edran moved with a speed that was less physical than elemental. Shadows peeled from him and took the form of wings and hands. He struck like a storm, sinking those wings into the phantoms and tearing them apart with a violence that made Marin's stomach lurch. The king's power burned him as he used it. Each movement cost him in blood, and every victory signed a new tally on his bones. The council's betrayers acted with a cruel efficiency, trying to isolate Edran and drive Marin into Lark's hands. Lark, exultant, pressed closer to his dark prize. As the palace became a battlefield, Marin realized something she had not allowed herself to consider. The healer's touch, when given willingly and wholly, did more than shift illness, it could purify. Her hands had moved the sickness once, but always as an exchange. She had tried to take without giving everything. Now, watching nobles fall and priests cry, she understood the law that had been whispered in Sira's back room. The curse could be cleansed only by a full surrender, a merging of blood so complete it rewrote the ledger. It was an old kind of magic, older than battle plans and decrees, that asked for life in return for life. It demanded a toll not of coin or comfort, but of being. The possibility knocked at her like a hammer. If she let herself give all, if she allowed herself to be emptied into the wound, perhaps the rot would have nowhere left to go. Perhaps the world would tilt. Perhaps Tobin would wake in a city where dawn no longer felt like a rumor. But the cost was a thing that had no grammar for how to be explained to a boy who loved wooden soldiers and hot bread. She moved toward Edran across the chaos, stepping between toppled banners and severed curtains, weaving through men who attacked phantoms with swords and prayers. He lay on the marble like a fallen god, breathing hard and slick with a sweat that smelled like metal. Lark's voice called out in the distance, triumph clotted in it. "Seal the doors!" men shouted, and the palace shuddered under the weight of human treachery. Edran's eyes found hers. In them was a plea so naked and human she almost stumbled. He clung to her hand as she bent to him, and she felt then the absolute distance between the institutions they represented and the small, sharp, private thing that linked them. Two people in a world that demanded they be more than people. He smiled, a thing that might have been comfort but was edged now by exhaustion. "If you do this," he warned softly, "there may be no return." "So there may be no cowardly life for me either," she replied. Her voice surprised her with its steadiness. She had carried fear like a blanket for years and grown used to its warmth. To give away what warmed you felt like a betrayal of your son, and a betrayal, she knew, was not always a sin. Sometimes it was the only path forward. They found a place in the shattered chapel, where candles burned despite everything and light pooled in sacred circles. Edran knelt, and Marin knelt beside him. Around them, the sounds of battle were dimmed by the soft, humming presence of things falling apart. She placed her hands on his chest, feeling the hurried thunder of his heart under the thin silk of his shirt. The sickness pressed like a live thing at the borders of his ribs, and when she closed her eyes, she could see the sickly shimmer of it like oil in water. To give your life is not a single act, but a sequence of little deaths. She felt each one as an unthreading, part of her memory loosening, small comforts detaching, the warmth in her palms thinning as if someone drew out the summer. Pain hammered through her at first. It was a white-hot engine that burned through her veins. She should have cried out. She did not. Her last clear thought of the world was a single image. Tobin sleeping, his small chest rising and falling, a soft toy soldier tucked like a talisman at his side. Edran's fingers trembled as he reached for a flask at his belt, an old ceremonial vessel worn by princes in the night for favors and vows. In the chaos, he unsheathed it and cut his palm. A bead of his blood welled and trembled like a tiny dark sun. Marin tasted iron at the back of her mouth, not yet his, but the memory of all the times she had held bleeding things and wished them whole. She pressed their palms together, letting skin meet skin, letting the warmth of two lives mingle. Their blood touched and pooled, a small, obscene altar of necessity. Then she kissed him. It was not a brief seal or a ceremonial token. It was an anguished thing born of rage and love and exhaustion. Their mouths met and their blood slid between them, and the world shrank to the drum of two hearts and the ache of a promise being paid. Light and shadow braided. The taste of him, metallic and deep, flooded her, and she felt the sickness recoil like a beast stung. Her body, the repository of so many small healings, opened and became a thoroughfare. His rot met her human light, and something like a chemist's miracle began. Pain flared, then softened, then became a spreading warmth, as if the burn had turned to glow. Around them, the palace seemed to sense the finality of the act. The phantoms shuddered, stalled, and then began to collapse like wet paper, as if the spell that animated them had been rendered impossible by a more ancient law taking hold. Lark's shouts turned ragged. Men who had stood to betray saw their scheming dry out like fruit in sun. The council's authority, which had been a solid, smooth thing, began to crack. Marin felt the last of her strength like a coin dropped into a well. She tasted dust and dawn. She thought of Tobin's laugh, of his small hand in hers. The world receded to the small ellipse of Edran's face before hers, to the rhythm of his breath slowing and the steadiness of his pulse under her fingers. Then darkness folded over her like a curtain. When she fell, the chapel filled with a sound like the entire city holding its breath. For a long, weightless moment, it seemed as if nothing could revive her. Edran's face loomed above her like a statue in grief, and then he moved with a speed that was sorrow given form. He cupped her cheek, and in a motion that was equal parts desperation and devotion, he pricked his palm again and let a single drop of his blood fall onto her lips. The effect was immediate and terrible. Her eyes fluttered open, glassy at first, then focusing on him with a clarity that made his breath catch. The kiss had been an offering, his blood was a bind. She tasted him, not as a predator's bite but like a promise that would not be undone. The life that returned to her was different, threaded now with a nocturnal thread that hummed under her bones. Half of her remained stubbornly human, the part that wanted morning bread and children's laughter. The other half woke with an appetite for dusk and a hunger for things that slept in shadow. The queen's death was quiet. She lay back and sighed as if some long task had finally been completed. "You kept your word," she whispered to Edran and to Marin both, "and I see now that some debts are meant to be carried by more than one pair of hands." Her eyes closed and did not open again. No surgeon could have given her a better end. She left them as if she had been a candle whose wick had finally burned down and the light had been returned to the world. The dawn that followed was not immediate. The sky was a bruise at first, then a softening, then a line of pink that spread like a rumor across rooftops. Folks in the market stopped in their tracks and watched. For the first time in memory, Blackmorrow saw a sunrise that felt like a new language rather than a tired greeting. Windows opened. Children blinked at a day that no one had been sure would ever come back. Tobin, asleep and safe, turned in his bed and murmured in his sleep as if dreaming of soldiers and of mornings. Edran did not roar or proclaim his victory. He knelt in the ruins of the chapel and, with hands that were suddenly human and clumsy, gathered Marin into his arms. The court was changed. Some faces had been lost, others had been exposed as traitors. The council was in tatters, its authority fractured. Dr. Lark had been taken, bound in chains forged from his own hubris. He had tried to bargain with facts and numbers and the cold geometry of science. Fate had answered in a language he could not parse. Marin awoke to the feel of soft fabric and the scent of smoke and bread. She blinked and found Edran hovering over her like a sentinel, his hair a halo in the dim light. He looked older, if anything, not younger. The binding of his blood to hers had changed both of them. The mark would be a slow thing to show itself, a map of nights and days they would have to navigate together. "You will not lose your mornings," he said, voice hoarse. "You will have them and more. You and I will keep the city. We will not hide our lives, but we will choose what we show the world." She thought of Tobin, and he was the first thing she asked for. Edran stood and led her into the sunlight. The city looked the same and different at once. Alleys that had been libraries of rumor were now clean with the residue of hope. The river gleamed in the newborn day as if a veil had been lifted. Tobin ran to her when he saw her, barreling into her like a comet. He climbed into her arms and smelled of sleep and sun and a boy who had been kept by love. Marin wept openly then, her tears a strange, holy salt that mingled with the day. Edran took up the throne in a manner fitting a man who had been remade by grief and choosing. He stood not as a tyrant, but as someone who had been given a second measure of what it meant to be tethered to a human heart. He would rule quietly in some ways, loudly in others. He would defend, and he would be defended. He promised Marin, in a voice that had no royal flourish but all the weight of a man who would rather die than see another child stolen, that he would stand at her side in secret where necessary and in public where possible. The world had changed. The laws that had once kept their kind separate would be tested, revised, broken, and rebuilt. Blackmorrow woke fully beneath a sun that seemed, for the first time in ages, willing to stay. Tobin climbed to the rooftops with other children and watched the light spill over the river in gold. He shouted into the morning, and the city echoed his voice like an answer. Marin stood below, fingers laced in Edran's, and for a long, aching moment, she believed that love could be both a weapon and a balm. The healing she had given had cost her dearly. It had also bought a dawn. They had paid what the prophecy had demanded, but in paying it they had rewritten the terms. Where once blood was currency to be spent in secret, now it was a pact shared in sunlight and in shadow. The Queen's last breath had been the hinge. The future's door had opened on hinges that creaked and groaned, yes, but they opened. Marin lifted her son to the edge of the parapet and watched him laugh as he chased a crow into the blue. The city exhaled, and for the first time in a long while, the people of Blackmorrow walked a little straighter under a sky that belonged to them again. Years had a way of softening the sharp edges of history, until legends could be pressed into the mouths of market girls and scholars alike. In the taverns by the river, cart drivers still argued over who'd seen the first sunrise after the winter of rot, though no one could agree on the exact day. And old men spat a little with pride when they told the tale of the single mother who had stolen morning back from the claws of night. Songs grew around the edges of fact, verses that made Marin Hale a saint one week and a danger the next. Children in the alleys played at kings and healers, and sometimes, if you listened on a windless afternoon, you could hear a lullaby with a strange cadence threaded through it, as if some nocturnal rhythm had learned to sleep. Marin moved through this changed city in a life that had been cut and sewn together in ways she never could have forecast. By daylight, she walked Blackmorrow's quieter lanes with the ordinary gait of a woman who had once carried ragged hope in her pockets and now carried a different kind of confidence. She ran a small apothecary by the market, a place where people gone to whisper about herbal cures and the ways the world healed itself. She sold bread to children and salves to old hands and listened to the confessions of people who wanted their hurts eased without question or crown. Customers liked her because she was straightforward, because she would not sugarcoat a prognosis nor turn a wound into politics. Tobin would visit between his lessons and mischief, a growing boy with the same stubborn jaw as his mother. He kept his mother's secret the way boys keep small treasures, declaredly and fiercely. By night, she took another shape. The city had not simply forgiven the crown, it had woven a treaty from the thin thread of what had been paid. Edran Valois ruled, and he ruled differently. He walked public promenades when the moon was thin, and he presided in bell-towered rooms when storms demanded counsel. He kept salons of policy and also kept a quieter vigil at the places where poverty could breed cruelty. Side by side with him, in the hush between midnight and dawn, Marin moved through the alleys and wards that had once been the city's hiding places. People who had once feared the dark now often found her there, a healer with one human heart and one new thing nested behind her ribs. Her presence was a calm the city had not been used to but needed. There were days when the duality made Marin dizzy. She still woke to the memory of the chapel's hush, of the taste of Edran's blood on her lips, and of a darkness that had folded around her like a cloak. The binding had not come without cost. There were nights when the hunger inside the new part of her roused, a quiet, strange appetite that asked for the coolness of dusk and the hush of shadow. She learned the contours of that hunger the way a new mother learns the curve of her child's head. By touch, by careful listening, by refusing panic and naming what was true. Edran taught her to temper it. Tobin taught her to laugh when gravity leaned toward despair. The city taught them both, slowly and stubbornly, that survival after a miracle required not only courage, but also a patient, mortal tenderness. In the hollowed candle, the archive of the city, a place of brittle paper, candle smoke, and scholars who loved both longer than they loved life, Siravan turned pages with a reverence that could verge on worship. She had refiled the old prophecies, editing them in hands that trembled less now that the kingdom had steadied. One night, in the glow of a lamp that smelled of wax and dust, she dipped a quill in red ink and wrote a line that would eventually find its way into a dozen hearthside tellings. The words were not new in meaning but new in tone. they bent prophecy into promise. "The healer's love will mend the dead," Sira wrote, "and from her tears the sun will rise." She sealed the page and let it rest among other manuscripts, knowing that legends change with the telling, but that truth, when held in paper and care, lasts longer. Academics argued about the phrasing for years. Some said Sira had been poetic, that she had softened a ledger into a lullaby. Others insisted she had merely made room for the complexity of what had happened. That healing is never merely a return to how things were, but also a remaking. Pilgrims came to the apothecary, leaving coins and tailies in equal measure. A baker in the market quarter wrote a small ode and hung it in his window, and a priest in a quiet chapel used the line as a comfort in his sermons. The city's storytellers loved the final simplicity of the rewritten prophecy. Parents tucked it into the ears of children who feared the dark and made it a small incantation against despair. Despite the light that had returned to Blackmorrow, the city's memory did not unmake cruelty overnight. There were those who would have liked the old divisions back. Nobles who preferred the clean slate of old hierarchies. Men like Dr. Corvin Lark, who had believed power could be seized by neat experiments and the right quantity of hubris. Lark's name lingered like a bad stain. His followers had scattered or been tried, and his peculiar phantoms were now the stuff of cautionary tailies. Yet Marin knew that vigilance was a kind of sacrament. To rest too easy was to invite recurrence. She and Edran kept watch in ways that were not always visible. A network of quiet informants, a few trusted guards who had seen the change and refused to turn back, and a small committee of citizens who met in the market to decide when mercy should be law. In quieter moments, and there were many, because even monarchs and monsters must sleep, Marin would walk to the river with Tobin at her side and watch the city breathe. They would stand beneath the same bridge where, years ago, rumors had been thick as fog, and she would tell him how she had once feared her own hands. He would ask practical questions about the old days, about whether the palace still smelled of lilies or of iron. He would ask about the queen with the simple curiosity of a child who wanted facts, not ghosts. Marin answered as honestly as she could without collapsing the delicate balance they had built. "It was love," she would say, because sometimes truth's simplest shape is the most sufficient one. Sometimes the world can be mended by hands that remember to be gentle. When people asked at taverns whether a mortal could truly touch a vampire and change the course of history, Marin would only smile and brush her apron. "No doctor could save the queen," she liked to tell them in the low, sure voice she used for tailies, because only love remembered the language of blood. The line fell into the room like a coin into a wishing well. It sounded like an old truth and felt like permission. It was not an answer to everything. It did not explain debts paid and debts owed, nor did it erase the scars that memory kept. But it was a final, small fact in a city that had once been kept awake by rot and superstition. That some bargains must be met with tenderness, and sometimes that tenderness is the only form of medicine that reaches the marrow. And so Marin's name moved between the ordinary and the mythic: healer, mother, witch, queen-maker, lover. People called her different things depending on their needs that day. She lived with all those names and kept what mattered. Tobin's hand in hers, Edran's shadow at her back, and the quiet certainty that between the dark and the dawn, she had found a place where love could be both a cure and an oath.